There exists a fundamental paradox at the heart of human relationships that most people never recognize. The very compassion that makes us feel virtuous can become the mechanism of our own destruction. We live in a culture that celebrates unlimited kindness as the highest moral achievement, yet those who practice this philosophy often find themselves depleted, manipulated, and strangely disconnected from the very people they're trying to serve. Modern psychology research reveals a disturbing truth that contradicts our most cherished beliefs about human goodness. Studies from UC Berkeley demonstrate that people who score highest on empathy and agreeableness measures also show the highest rates of burnout, depression, and what researchers call decision fatigue. The more we give of ourselves without boundaries, the less capable we become of genuine service to others or authentic connection to our own needs and values. Before we explore this uncomfortable territory together, I invite you to subscribe if you're ready to examine the shadow side of compassion and learn how true strength sometimes requires what appears to be harshness. This conversation challenges fundamental assumptions about goodness and morality that most people never question. The Renaissance political philosopher Niccolò Machiavelli understood something about human nature that modern self-help culture has forgotten: that unconstrained kindness is not actually kind in its ultimate effects. In his observations of power dynamics across Italian city-states, he noted that leaders who attempted to rule through pure benevolence inevitably created chaos, suffering, and eventual tyranny. Their refusal to establish firm boundaries and make difficult decisions didn't create harmony. It created power vacuums that were filled by those willing to exercise the strength that the kind leaders abdicated. This principle extends far beyond political leadership into every domain of human interaction. When we examine the psychology of what we call pathological kindness, we discover that it often stems not from genuine love or compassion, but from deep-seated fears about rejection, conflict, and our own worthiness. The person who cannot say no, who gives endlessly without regard for their own needs, who avoids any action that might cause temporary discomfort to others, is often operating from profound insecurity rather than authentic generosity. Dr. Harriet Braker's research on people-pleasing behavior reveals that chronic agreeableness correlates strongly with what psychologists call external locus of control, the belief that your value and safety depend entirely on others' approval. This creates a desperate dependency where your emotional well-being becomes hostage to the reactions and opinions of everyone around you. You become skilled at reading others' needs and desires while remaining completely disconnected from your own inner guidance system. This disconnection from internal authority creates what we might call compassionate paralysis. You become so focused on avoiding any action that might upset someone that you lose the ability to take decisive action when situations require clear leadership or firm boundaries. You enable destructive behavior in others because confronting it would cause temporary discomfort. You allow yourself to be overworked and undervalued because asking for what you deserve might create awkwardness or conflict. The psychological mechanism underlying this pattern involves what researchers term emotional fusion, the inability to distinguish between your emotional state and others' emotional states. When someone around you is upset, you automatically absorb their distress as if it were your own responsibility to fix. When someone expresses disappointment with your choices, you experience their disappointment as evidence that you've done something wrong, regardless of whether their expectations were reasonable or appropriate. This fusion creates a peculiar form of psychological imprisonment where you become responsible for managing everyone else's emotional experience while neglecting your own emotional needs. You develop hypervigilance around others' moods and reactions while losing touch with your own intuition, preferences, and boundaries. You become an expert at external emotional management while remaining incompetent at internal emotional awareness. Machiavelli observed that this dynamic doesn't actually serve others as much as we believe it does. When we take responsibility for others' emotional reactions, we inadvertently prevent them from developing their own emotional resilience and problem-solving capabilities. The child whose parent constantly shields them from disappointment never learns to cope with setbacks. The employee whose manager never provides direct feedback remains stuck in patterns that limit their growth. The friend who never experiences the natural consequences of their behavior continues making choices that ultimately damage their relationships and life outcomes. What appears to be kindness becomes a sophisticated form of control that keeps others dependent and prevents the very growth that genuine care would encourage. We avoid difficult conversations that could transform relationships because we're more committed to short-term comfort than long-term authenticity. We enable destructive patterns in others because confronting these patterns would require us to tolerate their temporary displeasure with us. The first sign that your kindness has become pathological appears in what psychologists call resentment accumulation. Despite your conscious commitment to being helpful and accommodating, you begin experiencing chronic irritation, frustration, or anger toward the very people you're trying to serve. This resentment often manifests indirectly through passive-aggressive behavior, subtle sabotage, or emotional withdrawal that confuses both you and others. This resentment is actually valuable information. It's your psyche's way of signaling that your giving has become unsustainable and inauthentic. When we give beyond our genuine capacity or motivation, when we say yes when our deeper wisdom wants to say no, we create internal conflict that eventually expresses itself as resentment toward those who make us give so much. But here's the crucial insight: no one can actually make you give beyond your capacity. The person asking for help isn't responsible for your inability to say no. The demanding colleague isn't responsible for your tendency to overcommit. The needy friend isn't responsible for your difficulty maintaining boundaries. Your resentment is pointing not toward others' unreasonable demands, but toward your own underdeveloped capacity for honest self-advocacy. The second sign emerges as what we might call identity erosion. When your sense of self becomes primarily defined by how helpful you are to others, you lose connection to your own desires, interests, and authentic preferences. You can tell others what they need, want, or should do, but you struggle to identify what you actually want for your own life. You become so skilled at reading external cues that you lose the ability to generate internal direction. This erosion creates a peculiar form of emptiness where you feel most alive when you're needed by others and most lost when you're alone with yourself. Your self-worth becomes dependent on your utility to others rather than your inherent value as a conscious being with your own legitimate needs and aspirations. You may achieve recognition as someone who's always available to help, but you sacrifice the development of your own unique gifts and the pursuit of your authentic path. The third sign manifests as what researchers call boundary confusion. You lose the ability to distinguish between what is your responsibility and what belongs to others. You feel guilty when others experience disappointment, even when their disappointment stems from unrealistic expectations. You feel obligated to fix problems that you didn't create and cannot actually solve. You take on emotional burdens that prevent others from developing their own coping strategies and problem-solving skills. This confusion creates chronic stress because you're attempting to control outcomes that lie outside your actual sphere of influence. You exhaust yourself trying to manage variables, other people's emotions, reactions, and life choices that you cannot and should not control. You become reactive rather than responsive, driven by others' needs rather than guided by your own wisdom and values. The psychological research is clear. People with poor boundaries experience higher rates of anxiety, depression, and what psychologists call compassion fatigue. They report feeling perpetually overwhelmed, despite often having fewer actual responsibilities than people with healthier boundaries. The problem isn't the amount of external demand, but the lack of internal structure that would allow them to respond selectively and sustainably to these demands. As we prepare to explore how Machiavelli's insights can guide us toward a more sophisticated understanding of genuine strength and authentic compassion, consider this question. What would change in your relationships if you were willing to disappoint people in service of deeper honesty and more sustainable connection? The answer to this question reveals the difference between kindness that serves and kindness that merely appeases our own fears about conflict and rejection. The most disturbing aspect of pathological kindness isn't what it does to us, it's what it enables in others. When we consistently prioritize harmony over honesty, comfort over growth, and agreeableness over authenticity, we create an environment that rewards manipulation and punishes integrity. We inadvertently train the people around us to exploit our inability to set boundaries while simultaneously making it difficult for genuinely honest people to connect with us authentically. Machiavelli's observations about human nature weren't cynical speculation. They were empirical observations about predictable patterns in human behavior. He noticed that people respond to incentives, and when kindness becomes unconditional and boundaries become non-existent, we create incentive structures that encourage others to take advantage of our good intentions. This isn't because people are inherently evil, but because humans naturally adapt their behavior to the environment we create through our responses. Consider what happens in relationships where one person consistently accommodates unreasonable demands. The accommodating person believes they're being loving and supportive, but they're actually training the other person to make increasingly unreasonable demands. Each time they say yes when they want to say no, they reinforce the pattern. Each time they absorb responsibility that belongs to the other person, they enable continued irresponsibility. Each time they avoid conflict by accepting unacceptable behavior, they guarantee that the unacceptable behavior will continue and escalate. Dr. John Gottman's research on relationship dynamics reveals that couples where one partner consistently avoids conflict show higher rates of relationship satisfaction in the short term but dramatically higher rates of divorce and relationship breakdown over time. The avoidance prevents the necessary negotiations that would allow both partners to get their legitimate needs met and create sustainable patterns of interaction. This dynamic extends beyond romantic relationships into professional settings, friendships, and family systems. The employee who never pushes back on unreasonable deadlines trains their manager to assign unreasonable deadlines. The friend who always accommodates plans that don't work for them trains their friends to assume their preferences don't matter. The family member who always smooths over dysfunction trains the family system to continue dysfunctional patterns rather than addressing underlying issues. The psychological mechanism underlying this pattern involves what researchers call intermittent reinforcement. When we occasionally assert boundaries or express our needs directly, it often creates such dramatic positive results that we assume the relationship has permanently improved. But without consistent reinforcement of these boundaries, the old patterns gradually return. The brief period of improved treatment makes us believe that our kindness is finally being appreciated, when actually our momentary assertiveness was what created the change. This creates a trap where we interpret others' positive responses to our boundary setting as validation that we should return to boundaryless giving. We mistake their respect for our strength as appreciation for our accommodation. We fail to recognize that the improvement in their behavior was directly caused by our willingness to enforce consequences for disrespectful treatment, not by our willingness to accept such treatment without complaint. The most sophisticated manipulators intuitively understand this psychology and exploit it systematically. They learn to recognize people who struggle with boundaries and develop specific strategies for overwhelming their decision-making processes. They may use emotional intensity to create urgency that prevents careful consideration. They may alternate between criticism and praise to create dependency and confusion. They may present themselves as victims who need rescue, knowing that people with poor boundaries cannot resist attempting to save others. These manipulative strategies work not because the targets are unintelligent or weak, but because they've been conditioned to prioritize others' immediate comfort over their own long-term well-being. They've developed sophisticated skills for reading and responding to others' emotional states while remaining relatively unconscious of their own needs and limits. This makes them valuable to people who want their needs met without reciprocal responsibility, but it also makes them vulnerable to exploitation by those willing to take advantage of such responsiveness. The manipulation often begins subtly with what psychologists call boundary testing. A new acquaintance or colleague makes requests that are slightly inappropriate or unreasonable to see how you respond. If you accommodate these requests without pushback, they'll learn that you're someone who can be influenced through emotional pressure, guilt, or appeals to your helpfulness. They gradually escalate their demands, always remaining just within the range of what you'll tolerate, slowly expanding that range over time. This process is so gradual that you may not notice it happening until you find yourself in situations that are drastically different from what you would have consciously chosen. You wake up in relationships where you're giving far more than you're receiving, jobs where your responsibilities have expanded without corresponding increases in compensation or recognition, or family dynamics where you're managing everyone else's problems while your own needs remain consistently unmet. The psychological cost of this dynamic involves what researchers call learned helplessness. When you consistently fail to advocate for your own needs and boundaries, you begin to believe that you don't have the power to change your circumstances. You develop a sense of victimization that prevents you from recognizing the choices you're making that create and maintain these patterns. You focus on others' unreasonable behavior rather than examining your own role in enabling that behavior. This helplessness creates a paradox where the person who seems most generous and helpful actually becomes least capable of creating positive change in their relationships and environment. Their unwillingness to create temporary discomfort through boundary enforcement prevents the kind of honest communication that could lead to genuine mutual respect and sustainable connection. Machiavelli understood that effective leadership, whether in politics, families, or personal relationships, requires the willingness to enforce consequences for destructive behavior, even when doing so creates short-term conflict or disappointment. He observed that leaders who refused to make difficult decisions didn't eliminate conflict. They simply ensured that conflicts would be resolved by whoever was willing to exercise power, often those least concerned with justice or collective well-being. This principle applies directly to personal relationships. When you refuse to enforce boundaries with someone who consistently disrespects your time, energy, or values, you don't create a conflict-free relationship. You create a relationship where that person gets to make all the decisions about how you'll be treated, and you surrender your influence over the dynamic. Your kindness becomes enablement, and your flexibility becomes doormat behavior that serves neither of you well. The solution isn't to become harsh or manipulative yourself, but to develop what we might call compassionate firmness. The ability to care about others' well-being while maintaining clear boundaries about what you will and won't accept in terms of treatment. This requires recognizing that allowing others to treat you poorly isn't actually kind to them, because it prevents them from learning how to be in respectful relationships and often enables their worst impulses. True compassion sometimes requires disappointing people, saying no to their requests, and allowing them to experience the natural consequences of their choices. It requires the wisdom to distinguish between helping someone grow and enabling their avoidance of growth. It requires the strength to tolerate others' temporary displeasure in service of long-term relationship health and mutual respect. The development of this compassionate firmness begins with recognizing that your worth isn't determined by your usefulness to others, and others' emotional reactions to your boundaries aren't evidence that you're being cruel or selfish. When someone becomes upset because you can't meet their demands, their upset is information about their expectations and emotional regulation, not about the appropriateness of your limits. As we move toward exploring how to develop authentic strength that serves both yourself and others, ask yourself this: what relationships in your life would improve if you were willing to risk temporary displeasure in order to establish clearer expectations and more honest communication? The answer to this question points toward areas where your kindness may have become a form of avoidance that's preventing deeper connection and mutual growth. Developing genuine strength in relationships requires understanding a fundamental distinction that most people never learn: the difference between being strong for others and being strong with others. When we're strong for others, we take responsibility for their emotional states, problems, and outcomes in ways that ultimately weaken both parties. When we're strong with others, we maintain our own center while remaining connected and supportive, creating space for mutual growth and authentic relationship. This distinction becomes crucial when we examine what Machiavelli called the necessity of appearing harsh to preserve what is actually good. In his political observations, he noticed that leaders who were willing to make difficult decisions and enforce unpopular but necessary policies often created more prosperity, security, and genuine well-being for their people than leaders who avoided all conflict and tried to please everyone. The apparent harshness served the deeper compassion of protecting and strengthening the whole system. The same principle applies to personal relationships, but it requires developing sophisticated emotional intelligence to apply it skillfully. True strength isn't about domination or control. It's about maintaining your own integrity while creating conditions that allow relationships to thrive based on mutual respect rather than mutual accommodation of dysfunction. The first element of authentic strength involves what psychologists call differentiation, the ability to remain emotionally connected to others without losing your sense of self. When someone you care about is upset, you can acknowledge their distress and offer appropriate support without automatically absorbing their emotional state as if it were your own. When someone disagrees with your decisions, you can listen to their perspective without immediately changing course to avoid their displeasure. This differentiation requires developing what we might call emotional sovereignty, the recognition that while you can influence others' experiences, you cannot and should not try to control their emotional responses. Their emotions belong to them and contain information about their inner world that they need to process and learn from. When you consistently try to manage others' emotional experiences, you deprive them of opportunities to develop emotional resilience and self-regulation skills. Dr. David Schnach's research on relationship psychology demonstrates that couples with higher levels of differentiation show greater relationship satisfaction, sexual intimacy, and personal growth over time. Each person maintains their individual identity while choosing to share their life with their partner, rather than merging into an indifferentiated unit where both people lose touch with their authentic selves. The practical application of differentiation begins with what we might call response choice awareness. When someone makes a request, expresses an emotion, or creates a problem, you pause long enough to consider multiple possible responses rather than automatically defaulting to accommodation or problem solving. You ask yourself questions like, what would serve this situation best? What are my actual capabilities and limitations right now? What response would support their growth rather than just their immediate comfort? This pause creates space for wisdom rather than reactivity. Instead of immediately saying yes to avoid potential conflict, you consider whether yes is actually the most helpful response. Instead of immediately jumping in to fix someone's problem, you consider whether they might benefit more from struggling with it themselves while receiving emotional support. Instead of immediately apologizing when someone is upset, you consider whether an apology is actually appropriate or whether it would simply enable their tendency to blame others for their emotional states. The second element involves developing what we might call strategic empathy, the ability to understand others' perspectives and emotions while maintaining clarity about appropriate boundaries and responses. This goes beyond simple emotional resonance to include wisdom about what actually helps people grow and what merely enables their avoidance of necessary challenges. Strategic empathy recognizes that sometimes the most loving response involves allowing others to experience natural consequences for their choices. When someone consistently arrives late and you always accommodate their lateness, you're preventing them from learning time management skills and respect for others' schedules. When someone frequently creates drama and you always provide extensive emotional support, you may be enabling their drama creation patterns rather than helping them develop more effective communication and problem-solving skills. This doesn't mean becoming cold or withholding support, but rather becoming more thoughtful about what type of support actually serves others' development versus what merely serves their immediate comfort or your own discomfort with their struggles. It means learning to tolerate others' disappointment when your boundaries prevent you from enabling patterns that don't serve their long-term growth. The third element requires understanding what Machiavelli called the virtue of timing, knowing when to be firm and when to be flexible, when to enforce consequences and when to show mercy, when to maintain distance and when to offer closeness. This timing cannot be determined by rules or formulas, but requires developing intuitive wisdom about the specific dynamics of each relationship and situation. Effective timing often means being firmer earlier in relationships or conflicts rather than later. When someone first begins testing your boundaries or treating you disrespectfully, a clear, calm response can often resolve the issue quickly and preserve the relationship. When you avoid addressing these issues early, they tend to escalate until much more dramatic responses become necessary, often damaging the relationship more severely than early boundary enforcement would have. The psychology research supports this approach. People generally respect clear, consistent boundaries more than they respect accommodating behavior, even when they initially push back against boundary enforcement. Dr. Henry Cloud's studies on boundary development show that relationships where boundaries are established early and maintained consistently show higher levels of mutual respect and satisfaction over time than relationships where boundaries are avoided to prevent conflict. The fourth element involves what we might call principled flexibility, the ability to maintain core values and standards while adapting your approach based on circumstances and the specific needs of different relationships. This isn't about having different standards for different people, but about expressing consistent principles through methods that fit the context and the other person's capacity for growth. With someone who responds well to direct communication, you might address issues straightforwardly and expect them to make necessary changes quickly. With someone who becomes defensive when confronted directly, you might need to address issues more gradually while maintaining the same core expectations. With someone who has limited emotional regulation skills, you might need to provide more support while they'll learn to meet reasonable standards, but you don't eliminate the standards entirely. This flexibility requires sophisticated judgment about the difference between accommodating someone's learning process and enabling their avoidance of growth. It means being patient with the pace of change while remaining clear about the direction of change that's necessary for the relationship to remain healthy and sustainable. The fifth element centers on what philosophers call moral courage, the willingness to act according to your values even when doing so creates social discomfort, relationship tension, or temporary isolation. This courage becomes essential when you're surrounded by people who have grown accustomed to your boundaryless accommodation and resist your development of healthier patterns. When you begin setting boundaries with people who have benefited from your lack of boundaries, you can expect pushback, guilt trips, accusations of selfishness, and attempts to manipulate you back into your old patterns. This resistance isn't evidence that you're doing something wrong. It's evidence that you're changing dynamics that others found advantageous even if they weren't healthy for you. Moral courage means staying connected to your deeper values during these periods of relationship renegotiation. It means remembering that temporary conflict in service of authentic relationship is more valuable than permanent peace built on inauthentic accommodation. It means trusting that people who truly care about your well-being will eventually adapt to your healthier boundaries, while people who only valued you for what you could provide may choose to distance themselves, and that this distancing, while painful, actually serves your long-term well-being. The development of authentic strength is ultimately about becoming someone who can love others without losing yourself, who can serve others without depleting yourself, and who can maintain connection while honoring your own needs and values. This isn't selfishness, it's the foundation that makes genuine generosity possible. As we prepare to explore specific strategies for implementing these principles in daily life, consider this question. What would become possible in your relationships if you trusted that others could handle your honesty, your boundaries, and your authentic needs? The answer to this question points toward the kind of connections that become available when strength and compassion unite in service of mutual growth and genuine intimacy. The transition from pathological kindness to authentic strength requires specific practices that can be implemented immediately, even while you're developing the deeper emotional intelligence that sustains these changes long-term. These practices aren't about becoming harsh or selfish, but about expressing genuine care through methods that actually serve both your own well-being and others' growth. The goal is to become someone whose kindness is more valuable because it comes from strength rather than weakness, whose support is more effective because it's offered consciously rather than compulsively. The first practice involves what we might call conscious response delay, building in specific time gaps between others' requests and your responses to create space for thoughtful decision-making rather than automatic accommodation. When someone asks for your help, time, energy, or resources, instead of immediately saying yes to avoid their potential disappointment, you develop the habit of saying, "Let me think about that and get back to you." This simple phrase accomplishes several crucial objectives simultaneously. It prevents you from overcommitting when you're caught off guard or feeling pressured. It gives you time to consider your actual capacity and willingness rather than just responding to immediate emotional pressure. It communicates to others that your time and energy have value and require thoughtful allocation. Most importantly, it begins training your decision-making process to operate from internal wisdom rather than external pressure. The practice of response delay requires overcoming what psychologists call urgency addiction, the belief that most requests require immediate responses. In reality, very few situations are genuinely urgent in ways that require you to sacrifice thoughtful consideration. Most urgent requests are actually reflections of others' poor planning, anxiety management, or attempts to override your natural resistance to unreasonable demands. When you implement response delays, you'll often discover that requests that seemed urgent become less pressing when others have to wait for your response. Problems that seem to require your immediate intervention get solved by other means when your automatic availability is removed. People who seemed desperately in need of your help find alternative resources when they realize they can't simply assume your assistance. The second practice centers on what we might call values-based decision-making, developing clarity about your core principles and using these principles as the primary filter for evaluating requests and opportunities. Instead of making decisions based on what others want, what would avoid conflict, or what would make you seem helpful. You learn to make decisions based on what aligns with your authentic values and long-term aspirations. This requires first developing explicit awareness of what you actually value most deeply. Many people who struggle with boundaries have spent so much time focusing on others' needs that they've lost touch with their own guiding principles. They can articulate what they think they should value or what others expect them to value, but they struggle to identify what actually motivates and inspires them when they're not performing for others' approval. The process of values clarification involves examining your experiences of fulfillment, energy, and authentic engagement. When do you feel most alive and connected to your own sense of purpose? What activities or relationships generate genuine enthusiasm rather than obligation? What accomplishments feel meaningful to you independent of others' recognition or approval? The answers to these questions point toward your authentic values, which can then serve as guides for decision-making. Once you have clarity about your values, every request becomes an opportunity to practice alignment. When someone asks for your time, you can evaluate whether saying yes would support or undermine what you care about most. When someone pressures you to make a commitment, you can consider whether that commitment moves you toward or away from your authentic aspirations. This doesn't mean becoming selfish or uncaring, but rather becoming strategic about how you invest your limited resources in ways that allow you to contribute from your strengths rather than your weaknesses. The third practice involves developing what we might call emotional non-absorption, the ability to witness others' emotional experiences without automatically taking responsibility for managing those experiences. When someone becomes upset, disappointed, or frustrated, instead of immediately trying to fix their emotional state, you learn to remain present and supportive while allowing them to process their own emotions. This practice requires distinguishing between empathy and emotional fusion. Empathy involves understanding and caring about others' experiences while maintaining your own emotional center. Emotional fusion involves losing your emotional boundaries and experiencing others' emotions as if they were your own responsibilities. Empathy supports connection and appropriate helpfulness. Emotional fusion creates codependency and mutual psychological dysfunction. Practical emotional non-absorption begins with physical awareness. When someone around you becomes emotionally activated, notice what happens in your own body. Do you automatically tense up, hold your breath, or feel compelled to do something immediately? These physical responses often indicate that you're beginning to absorb their emotional state rather than simply witnessing it with compassion. The practice involves consciously maintaining your own breathing, posture, and emotional center while remaining emotionally available to the other person. You can acknowledge their distress. "I can see you're really frustrated," without taking responsibility for eliminating their frustration. You can offer appropriate support. "Is there something specific I can do to help?" without assuming that their emotional state is your problem to solve. The fourth practice centers on what we might call consequence consistency, following through on stated boundaries and expectations even when doing so creates temporary discomfort or relationship tension. This is often the most challenging aspect of developing authentic strength because it requires tolerating others' disappointment, anger, or manipulation attempts without reverting to accommodation patterns. Consequence consistency means that when you tell someone you're not available to help with something, you don't change your mind when they express disappointment or try to guilt you into helping anyway. When you establish an expectation about how you want to be treated, you enforce that expectation even when the other person tests your resolve. When you set a deadline or limit, you maintain that boundary even when others try to negotiate for exceptions. This practice often requires planning specific responses to predictable manipulation tactics. If someone typically responds to your boundaries by accusing you of being selfish, you can prepare responses like, "I understand you're disappointed, and I'm still not available to help with this. If someone usually tries to create urgency to override your thoughtful decision-making, you can respond with, "I know this feels urgent to you, and I still need time to consider whether I can commit to this." The key is maintaining emotional equilibrium while enforcing consequences, avoiding both aggressive defensiveness and guilty capitulation. You're not trying to punish anyone or prove a point. You're simply maintaining the standards that allow your relationships to remain healthy and sustainable. The fifth practice involves what we might call growth-oriented communication, speaking truthfully about your experiences, needs, and observations in ways that invite others to engage more authentically rather than simply accommodating their current patterns. This means sharing your genuine thoughts and feelings instead of filtering everything through what you think others want to hear. Growth-oriented communication requires courage because it often reveals areas where relationships need to evolve or where others need to develop better skills. When you honestly express that someone's behavior affects you negatively, you're inviting them to consider changing that behavior. When you share your actual needs instead of pretending you don't have any, you're asking others to consider how they might contribute to meeting those needs. This communication style serves others' development by providing accurate feedback about the impact of their behavior and choices. People cannot grow beyond patterns they don't realize are problematic. By speaking honestly about your experience, you offer valuable information that can help others understand how their actions affect the people they care about. The practice begins with small, low-stakes situations where you share minor preferences or observations instead of automatically accommodating or staying silent. Instead of saying, "anything is fine," when asked for your preference, you share what you actually prefer. Instead of saying, "no problem," when someone's behavior creates inconvenience for you, you kindly but honestly acknowledge the impact. As you develop comfort with minor honesty, you can gradually address more significant issues that affect your well-being or the quality of your relationships. The goal isn't to become critical or demanding, but to become a person whose feedback is valuable because it's honest and whose support is meaningful because it comes from authentic choice rather than compulsive obligation. These practices work together to create what we might call sustainable compassion, the ability to care for others from a place of strength that doesn't deplete your resources or enable their weaknesses. When your kindness comes from conscious choice rather than unconscious compulsion, when your support serves others' growth rather than just their comfort, when your boundaries create space for authentic relationship rather than resentful accommodation, you become capable of the kind of love that actually transforms people's lives rather than simply managing their immediate emotional states. The question that guides this ongoing practice is, how can I express genuine care for others while honoring my own needs and supporting everyone's authentic development? The answer to this question evolves as you grow, but the commitment to asking it consistently creates the foundation for relationships based on mutual respect, honest communication, and shared growth rather than unconscious patterns of manipulation and accommodation. If this exploration has challenged your assumptions about kindness and strength, consider subscribing for more insights into the psychology of authentic relationships and effective personal boundaries. Share this with others who might benefit from understanding how genuine compassion sometimes requires what appears to be firmness, and remember that developing these skills serves not only your own well-being but also creates the conditions for others to develop their own emotional maturity and authentic strength.